Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read-aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, @gmail.com. The first season of this podcast is dedicated to the memory of my friend, Ed Sears. He was a runner, coach, science enthusiast, and science fiction aficionado who was often gently encouraging of my crazy ideas. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes. Snuggle into your sleeping space and listen to tonight's tale. Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton, originally published in 1960. Chapter 17. Throg Justice. The musty stench was so strong that Shan could no longer fight the demands of his outraged stomach. He rolled on his side, retching violently until the sour smell of his illness battled the foul odor of the ship. His memories of how he had come into this place were vague. His body was a mass of dull pain, as if he had been scorched. Scorched. Had the Throgs used one of their energy whips to subdue him? The last clear thing he could recall was that slow withdrawal down the cleft inside the skull rock, the Throg not too far away, the sound from the entrance. A Throg prisoner. Through the pain and the sickness, the horror of that bit doubly deep. Terrans did not fall alive into Throg hands, not if they had the means of ending their existence within reach. But his hands and arms were caught behind him in an unbreakable lock, some gadget not unlike the Terran force bar used to restrain criminals, he decided groggily. The cubby in which he lay was black dark, but the quivering of the deck and the bulkheads about him told Shan that the ship was in flight. And there could be but two destinations, either the camp where the Throg force had taken over the Terran installations, or the mothership of the raiders. If Torvald's earlier surmise was true, and the aliens were hunting a Terran to talk in the transport, then they were heading for the camp. And because a man who still lives and who is not yet broken can also hope, Shan began to think ahead to the camp and a faint, thin chance of escape. For on the surface of Warlock there was a thin chance. In the mothership of the Throgs, none at all. Torvald and the Wyverns, could he hope for any help from them? Shan closed his eyes against the thick darkness and tried to reach out to touch, somewhere, Torvald with his disc, or perhaps the Wyvern who had talked of Trav and shared dreams. Shan focused his thoughts on the young Wyvern witch, visualizing with all the detail he could summon out of memory the brilliant patterns about her slender arms, her thin, fragile wrists, those other designs overlaying her features. He could see her in his mind, but she was only a puppet, without life, certainly without power. Torvald. Now Shan fought to build a mental picture of the survey officer, making his stand at that window, grasping his disc, with the sun bringing gold to his hair and showing the bronze of his skin, those gray eyes which could be ice, that jaw with the tight set of a trap upon occasion. And Shan made contact. He touched something, a flickering like a badly tuned tri-D, far more fuzzy than the mind pictures the wyvern had paraded for him, but he had touched, and Torvald too had been aware of his contact. Shan fought to find that thread of awareness again. Patiently he once more created his vision of Torvald, adding every detail he could recall. Small things about the other which he had not known that he had noticed. The tiny arrow-shaped scar near the base of the officer's throat. The way his growing hair curled at the ends. The look of one eyebrow slanting abruptly toward his hairline when he was dubious about something. Shan strove to make a figure as vivid as Logali and Trav had been in the mist of the illusion. Where? This time Shan was prepared. He did not let that mind image dissolve in his excitement at recapturing the link. Throg ship. He said the words aloud over and over, but still he held to his picture of Torvald. Will. Only that one word. The thread between them snapped again. Only then did Shan become conscious of a change in the ship's vibration. Were they setting down? And where? Let it be at the camp. It must be the camp. There was no jar at that landing. Just that 1 second the vibration told him the ship was alive and airborne, and the next a dead quiet testified that they had landed. Shan, his sore body stiff with tension, waited for the next move on the part of his captors. He continued to lie in the dark, still queasy from the stench of the cell, too keyed up to try to reach Torvald. There was a dull grating over his head, and he looked up eagerly, to be blinded by a strong beam of light. Claws hooked painfully under his arms, and he was manhandled up and out, dragged along a short passage and pitched free of the ship, falling hard upon trodden earth and rolling over, gasping as the seared skin of his body was rasped and abraded. The Terran lay face up now, and as his eyes adjusted to the light, he saw a ring of Throg heads blotting out the sky as they inspected their catch impassively. The mouth mandibles of one moved with a faint clicking. Again, claws fastened in his armpits brought Shan to his feet, holding him erect. Then the Throg who had given that order moved closer. His hand claws grasped a small metal plate surmounted by a hoop of thin wire over which was stretched a web of threads glistening in the sun. Holding that hoop on a level with his mouth, the alien clicked his mandibles, and those sounds became barely distinguishable basic galactic words.
You Throg meat.
For a moment, Shan wondered if the alien meant that statement literally, or was it a conventional expression for a prisoner among their land?
Do as told.
That was clear enough, and for the moment the Terran did not see that he had any choice in the matter. But Shan refused to make any sign of agreement to either of those two limited statements. Perhaps the Beetleheads did not expect any. The alien who had pulled him to his feet continued to hold him erect, but the attention of the Throg with the translator switched elsewhere. From the alien ship emerged a second party. The Throg in their midst was unarmed and limping. Although to Terran eyes one alien was the exact counterpart of the other, Shan thought that this one was the prisoner in the skull cave. Yet the indications now suggested that he had only changed one captivity for another and was in disgrace among his kind. Why? The Throg limped up to front the leader with the translator, and his guards fell back. Again mandibles clicked, were answered, though the sense of that exchange eluded Shan. At one point in the report, if report it was, he himself appeared to be under discussion, for the injured Throg waved a hand claw in the Terran's direction. But the end to the conference came quickly enough, and in a manner which Shan found shocking. Two of the guards stepped forward, caught at the injured Throg's arms, and drew him away, leading him out into a space beyond the grounded ship. They dropped their hold on him, returning at a trot. The officer clicked an order. Blasters were unholstered, and the Throg in the field shriveled under a vicious concentration of crossbolts. Shan gasped. He certainly had no liking for Throgs, but this execution carried overtones of a cold-blooded ferocity which transcended anything he had known, even in the callous brutality of the dumps. Limp, and more than a little sick again, he watched the Throg officer turn away, and a moment later he was forced along in the other's wake to the domes of the once Terran camp. Not just to the camp in general, he discovered a minute later, but to that structure which had housed the comm unit linking them with ships cruising the solar lanes and with the patrol. So Torvald had been right. They needed a Terran to broadcast, to cover their tracks here and lay a trap for the transport. Shan had no idea how much time he had passed among the wyverns. The transport, with its load of unsuspecting settlers, might already be in the system of Circe, plotting a landing orbit around Warlock, broadcasting her recognition signal and a demand for a beam to ride her in. Only this time the Throgs were out of luck. They had picked up one prisoner who could not help them, even if he had wanted to do so. The mysteries of the highly technical installations in this dome were just that to Shan Lante, complete mysteries. He had not the slightest idea of how to activate the machines, let alone broadcast in the proper code. A cold spot of terror gathered in his middle, spreading outward through his smarting body, for he was certain that the Throgs would not believe that. They would consider his protestations of ignorance as a stubborn refusal to cooperate, and what would happen to him then would be beyond human endurance. Could he bluff, play for time? But what would that time buy him except to delay the inevitable? In the end, that small hope based on his momentary contact with Torvald made him decide to try that bluff. There had been changes in the comm dome since the capture of the camp. A squat box on the floor sprouted a collection of tubes from its upper surface. Perhaps that was some Throg equivalent of Terran equipment in place on the wide table facing the door. The Throg leader clicked into his translator.
"You call ship."
Shan was thrust down into the operator's chair, his bound arms still twisted behind him so that he had to lean forward to keep on the seat at all. Then the throg who had pushed him there roughly forced a set of comm earphones and speech mic onto his head.
Call ship,
clicked the alien officer. So time must be running out. Now was the moment to bluff. Shan shook his head, hoping that the gesture of negation was common to both their species. I don't know the code, he said aloud. The throg's bulbous eyes gazed at his moving lips. Then the translator was held before the Terran's mouth. Shan repeated his words, heard them reissue as a series of clicks, and waited. So much depended now on the reaction of the Beetlehead officer. Would he summarily apply pressure to enforce his order, or would he realize that it was possible that all Terrans did not know that code, and so he could not produce in a captive's head any knowledge that had never been there, with or without physical coercion? Apparently the latter logic prevailed for the present. The throg drew the translator back to his mandibles.
when ship call, you answer. Make lip talk your words. Say bad sickness here, need help. Code man dead. You talk in his place. I listen. You say wrong, you die. You die a long time. Hurt bad all that time.
Clear enough, so he had been able to buy a little time. But how soon before the incoming ship would call? The throgs seemed to expect it. Shan licked his blistered lips. He was sure that the throg officer meant exactly what he said in that last grisly threat. Only, would anyone, throg or human, live very long in this camp if Shan got his warning through? The transport would have been accompanied on the big jump by a patrol cruiser, especially now with throgs littering deep space the way they were in this sector. Let Shan alert the ship, and the cruiser would know. Swift punitive action would be visited on the camp. Throgs could begin to make their helpless prisoner regret his rashness. Then all of them would be blotted out together, prisoner and captors alike, when the cruiser came in. If that was his last chance, he'd play it that way. The throgs would kill him anyhow. He hadn't the least doubt of that. They kept no long-term Terran prisoners and never had. And at least he could take this nest of devil beetles along with him. Not that the thought did anything to dampen the fear which made him weak and dizzy. Shan Lante might be tough enough to fight his way out of the dumps, but to stand up and defy throgs face to face like a video hero was something else. He knew that he could not do any spectacular act. If he could hold out to the end without cracking, he would be satisfied. 2 more throgs entered the dome. They stalked to the far end of the table which held the comm equipment, and frequently pausing to consult a Terran work tape set in a reader, they made adjustments to the spotter beam broadcaster. They worked slowly but competently, testing each circuit. Preparing to draw in the Terran transport, holding the large ship until they had it helpless on the ground. The Terran began to wonder how they proposed to take the ship over once they did have it on planet. Transports were armed for ground fighting. Although they rode in on a beam broadcast from a camp, they were prepared for unpleasant surprises on a planet's surface. Such were certainly not unknown in the history of survey. which meant that the Throgs had, in turn, some assault weapon they believed superior, for they radiated confidence now. But could they handle a patrol cruiser ready to fight? The Throg technicians made a last check of the beam, reporting in clicks to the officer. The alien gave an order to Shan's guard before following them out. A loop of wire rope dropped over the Terran's head, tightened about his chest, dragging him back against the chair until he grunted with pain. 2 more loops made him secure in a most uncomfortable posture, and then he was left alone in the comm dome. An abortive struggle against the wire rope taught him the folly of such an effort. He was in deep freeze as far as any bodily movement was concerned. Shan closed his eyes, settled to the same concentration he had labored to acquire on the Throg ship. If there was any chance of the Wyvern communication working again, here and now was the time for it. Again he built his mental picture of Torvald, as detailed as he had made it in the Throg ship, and with that to the forefront of his mind, Shan strove to pick up the thread which could link them. Was the distance between this camp and the sea-girt city of the Wyverns too great? Did the Throgs unconsciously dampen out that mental reaching, as the Wyverns had said they did when they had sent him to free the captive in the skull? Drops gathered in the unkempt tight curls on his head, trickled down to sting on his tender skin. He was bathed in the moisture summoned by an effort as prolonged and severe as if he labored physically under a hot sun at the top speed of which his body was capable. Torvald, but not standing by the window in the Wyvern stronghold. Torvald with the amethyst of heavy Warlockian foliage at his back. So clear was the new picture that Shan might have stood only a few feet away. Torvald there, with the wolverines at his side, and behind him sun glinted on the gem-patterned skin of more than one wyvern. Where? That demand from the survey officer, curt, clear, so perfect the word might have rung audibly through the dome. The camp, Shan hurled back, frantic with fear that once again their contact might fail. They want me to call in the transport, he added that. How soon? Don't know. They have the guide beam set. I'm to say there's illness here. They know I can't code. All he could see now was Torvald's face, intent, the officer's eyes cold sparks of steel, bearing the impress of a will as implacable as a Throg's. Shan added his own decision. I'll warn the ship off. They'll send in the patrol. There was no change in Torvald's expression. Hold out as long as you can. Cold enough, no promise of help, nothing on which to build hope. Yet the fact that Torvald was on the move, away from the Wyvern City, meant something. And Shan was sure that thick vegetation could be found only on the mainland. Not only was Torvald ashore, but there were wyverns with him. Could the officer have persuaded the witches of Warlock to forsake their hands-off policy and join him in an attack on the Throg camp? No promise, not even a suggestion that the party Shan had envisioned was moving in his direction, yet somehow he believed that they were. There was a sound from the doorway of the dome. Shan opened his eyes. There were Throgs entering, 1 to go to the guide beam, 2 heading for his chair. He closed his eyes again in a last attempt, backed by every remaining ounce of his energy and will. Ships in range. Throgs here. Torvald's face, dimmer now, snapped out while a blow on Shan's jaw rocked his head cruelly, made his ears sing, his eyes water. He saw Throgs only, and one held the translator.
You talk.
A tri-jointed arm reached across his shoulder, triggered a lever, pressed a button. The headset cramping his ear let out a sudden growl of sound. The comm was activated. A claw jammed the mic closer to Shan's lips, but also slid in range the webbed loop of the translator. Shan shook his head at the incoming rattle of code. The Throg with the translator was holding the other headset close to his own ear pit, and the claws of the guard came down on Shan's shoulders in a cruel grip, a threat of future brutality. The rattle of code continued while Shan thought furiously. This was it. He had to give a warning, and then the aliens would do to him just what the officer had threatened. Shan could not seem to think clearly. It was as if in his efforts to contact Torvald, he had exhausted some part of his brain, so that now he was dazed just when he needed quick wits the most. This whole scene had a weird unreality. He had seen its like 1,000 times on fiction tapes. The Terran hero menaced by aliens intent on saving. Was it out of one of those fiction tapes he had devoured in the past that Shan recalled that scrap of almost forgotten information? The Terran began to speak into the mic, for there had come a pause in the rattle of code. He used Terran, not Basic, and he shaped the words slowly. Warlock calling. Trouble. Sickness here. Comm officer dead. He was interrupted by another burst of code. The claws of his guard twisted into the naked flesh of his shoulders in vicious warning. Warlock calling, he repeated. Need help? Who are you? The demand came in Basic. On board the transport, they would have a list of every member of the survey team. Lante. Shan drew a deep breath. He was so conscious of those claws on his shoulders, of what would follow. This is Mayday, he said distinctly, hoping desperately that someone in the control cabin of the ship now in orbit would catch the true meaning of that ancient call of complete disaster. Mayday, Beetles, over and out. Chapter 18. Storm's Ending. Shan had no answer from the transport, only the continuing hum of a contact still open between the dome and the control cabin miles above Warlock. The Terran breathed slowly, deeply, felt the claws of the Throg bite his flesh as his chest expanded. Then, as if a knife slashed, the hum of that contact was gone. He had time to know a small flash of triumph. He had done it. He had aroused suspicion in the transport. When the Throg officer clicked to the alien manning the landing beam, Shan's exultation grew. The beetlehead must have accepted that cut in communication as normal. He was still expecting the Terran ship to drop neatly into his claws. But Shan's respite was to be very short, only timed by a few breaths. The Throg at the riding beam was watching the indicators. Now he reported to his superior, who swung back to face the prisoner. Although Shan could read no expression on the beetle's face, he did not need any clue to the other's probable emotions. Knowing that his captive had somehow tricked him, the alien would now proceed relentlessly to put into effect the measures he had threatened. How long before the patrol cruiser would plan it? That crew was used to alarms, and their speed was 3 or 4 times greater than that of the bulkier transports. If the Throgs didn't scatter now, before they could be caught in one attack. The wire rope which held Shan clamped to the chair was loosened, and he set his teeth against the pain of restored circulation. This was nothing compared to what he faced, he knew that. They jerked him to his feet, faced him toward the outer door, and propelled him through it with a speed and roughness indicative of their feelings. The hour was close to dusk, and Shan glanced wistfully at promising shadows, though he had given up hope of rescue by now. If he could just get free of his guards, he could at least give the beetleheads a good run. He saw that the camp was deserted. There was no sign about the domes that any Throgs sheltered there. In fact, Shan saw no aliens at all except those who had come from the comm dome with him. Of course, the rest must be in ambush, waiting for the transport to planet. What about the Throg ship or ships? Those must have been hidden also, and the only hiding place for them would be aloft. There was a chance that the Throgs had so flung away their chance for any quick retreat. Yes, the aliens could scatter over the countryside and so escape the first blast from the cruiser. But they would simply maroon themselves to be hunted down by patrol landing parties who would comb the territory. The beetles could so prolong their lives for a few hours, maybe a few days, but they were really ended on that moment when the transport cut communication. Shan was sure that the officer, at least, understood that. The Terran was dragged away from the domes toward the river down which he and Torvald had once escaped. Moving through the dusk in parallel lines, he caught sight of other Throg squads, well armed, marching in order to suggest that they were not yet alarmed. However, he had been right about the ships. There were no flyers grounded on the improvised field. Shan made himself as much of a burden as he could. At the best, he could so delay the guards entrusted with his safekeeping. At the worst, he could earn for himself a quick ending by blaster, which would be better than the one they had for him. He went limp, falling forward into the trampled grass. There was an exasperated click from the Throg who had been herding him, and the Terran tried not to flinch from a sharp kick delivered by a clawed foot. Feigning unconsciousness, the Terran listened to the unintelligible clicks exchanged by Throgs standing over him. His future depended now on how deep lay the alien officer's anger. If the beetlehead wanted to carry out his earlier threats, he would have to order Shan's transportation by the fleeing force. Otherwise, his life might well end here and now. Claws hooked once more on Shan. He was boosted up on the horny carapace of a guard, the bonds on his arms taken off and his numbed hands brought forward to be held by his captor so that he lay helpless, a cloak over the other's hunched shoulders. The ghost flares of bushes and plants blooming in the gathering twilight gave a limited light to the scene. There was no way of counting the number of Throgs on the move, But Shan was sure that all the enemy ships must have been emptied except for skeleton crews, and perhaps others had been ferried in from their hidden base somewhere in Circe's system. He could only see a little from his position on the Throg's back, but ahead a ripple of beetle bodies slipped over the bank of the river cut. The aliens were working their way into cover, fitting into the dapple shadows with a skill which argued a long practice in such elusive maneuvers. Did they plan to try to fight off a cruiser attack? That was pure madness. Or, Shan wondered, did they intend to have the Terrans met by one of their own major ships somewhere well above the surface of Warlock? His bearer turned away from the stream cut, carrying Shan out into that field which had first served the Terrans as a landing strip, then offered the same service to the Throgs. They passed 2 more parties of aliens on the move, manhandling with them bulky objects the Terran could not identify. Then he was dumped unceremoniously to the hard earth, only to lie there a few seconds before he was flopped over on a framework which grated unpleasantly against his raw shoulders, his wrists and ankles being made fast so that his body was spread-eagled. There was a click of orders. The frame was raised and dropped with a jarring movement into a base, and he was held erect, once more facing the Throg with the translator. This was it. Shan began to regret every small chance he had had to end more cleanly. If he had attacked one of the guards, even with his hands bound, he might have flustered the Throg into retaliatory blaster fire. Fear made a thicker fog about him than the green mist of the illusion. Only this was no illusion. Shan stared at the Throg officer with sick eyes, knowing that no one ever quite believes that a last evil will strike at him, that he had clung to a hope which had no existence. Lante! The call burst in his head with a painful force. His dazed attention was outwardly on the alien with the translator, but that inner demand had given him a shock. Here, Torvald! Where? The other struck in again with an urgent demand singing through Shan's brain. Give us a fixed point, away from camp, but not too far. Quick! A fixed point? What did the survey officer mean? A fixed point. For some reason, Shan thought of the ledge on which he had lain to watch the first Throg attack, and the picture of it was etched on his mind as clearly as memory could paint it. Torvald? Again his voice and his mind call were echoes of each other. But this time he had no answer. Had that demand meant Torvald and the Wyverns were moving in, putting to use the strange distance-erasing power the witches of Warlock could use by desire? But why had they not come sooner? And what could they hope to accomplish against the now scattered but certainly unbroken enemy forces? The Wyverns had not been able to turn their power against one injured Throg, by their own accounting. How could they possibly cope with well-armed and alert aliens in the field?
You die slow.
The Throg officer clicked, and the emotionless, toneless translation was all the more daunting for that lack of color.
Your people come. See.
So that was the reason they had brought him to the landing field. He was to furnish a grisly warning to the crew of the cruiser. However, there the Throgs were making a bad mistake if they believed that his death by any ingenious method could scare off Terran retaliation. I die, you follow. Shan tried to make that promise emphatic. Did the Throg officer expect the Terran to beg for his life or a quick death? Again he made his threat, straight into the web, hearing it split into clicks.
Perhaps,
the Throg returned.
but you die the first.
Get to it! Shan's voice scaled up. He was close to the ragged edge, and the last push toward the breaking point had not been the Throg speech, but that message from Torvald. If the survey officer was going to make any move in the mottled dusk, it would have to be soon. Mottled dusk. The Throgs had moved a little away from him. Shan looked beyond them to the perimeter of the cleared field, not really because he expected to see any rescuers break from cover there. And when he did see a change, Shan thought his own sight was at fault. Those splotches of waxy light which marked certain trees, bushes, and scrubby ground-hugging plants were spreading, running together in pools, and from those center cores of concentrated glow, tendrils of mist lazily curled out as a many-armed creature of the sea might allow its appendages to float in the water which supported it. Tendrils crossed, met, and thickened. There was a growing river of eerie light which spread, again resembling a sea wave licking out onto the field. And where it touched, unlike the wave, it did not retreat, but lapped on. Was he actually seeing that? Shan could not be sure. Only the gray light continued to build, faster now, its speed of advance matching its increase in bulk. Shan somehow connected it with the veil of illusion. If it was real, there was a purpose behind it. There was an aroused clicking from the Throgs. A blaster bolt cracked, its spiteful, sickly yellow slicing into the nearest tongue of gray. But that luminous fog engulfed the blast and was not dispelled. Shan forced his head around against the support which held him. The mist crept across the field from all quarters, walling them in. Running at the ungainly lope which was their best effort at speed were half a dozen Throgs emerging from the river section. Their attitude suggested panic-stricken flight, and when one tripped on some unseen obstruction and went down, to fall beneath a descending tongue of phosphorescence, he uttered a strange, high-pitched squeal, thin and faint, but still a note of complete, mindless terror. The Throgs surrounding Shan were firing at the fog, first with precision, then raggedly as their bolts did nothing to cut that opaque curtain drawing in about them. From inside that mist came other sounds, noises, calls, and cries, all alien to him, and perhaps also to the Throgs. There were shapes barely to be discerned through the swirls. Perhaps some were Throgs in flight, but certainly others were non-Throg in outline. And the Terran was sure that at least 3 of those shapes, all different, had been in pursuit of one fleeing Throg, heading him off from that small open area still holding about Shan. For the Throgs were being herded in from all sides, the handful who had come from the river, the others who had brought Shan there, and the action of the mist was pushing them into a tight knot. Would they eventually turn on him, wanting to make sure of their prisoner before they made a last stand against whatever lurked in the fog? To Shan's continued relief, the aliens seemed to have forgotten him. Even when one cowered back against the very edge of the frame on which the Terran was bound, the beetlehead did not look at this helpless prey. They were firing wildly, with desperation in every heavy thrust of bolt. Then one Throg threw down his blaster, raised his arms over his head, and voicing the same high wail uttered by his comrade in arms earlier, he ran straight into the mist where a shape materialized, closing in behind him, cutting him off from his fellows. That break demoralized the others. The Throg commander burned down 2 of his company with his blaster, but 3 more broke past him to the fog. One of the remaining party reversed his blaster, swung the stock against the officer's carapace, beating him to his knees before the attacker raced on into the billows of the mist. Another threw himself on the ground and lay there, pounding his claws against the baked earth, while a remaining 2 continued with stolid precision to fire at the lurking shapes which could only be half seen, and a third helped the officer to his feet. The Throg commander reeled back against the frame, his musky body scent filling Shan's nostrils, but he too paid no attention to the Terran, though his horny arms scraped across Shan's. Holding both of his claws to his head, he staggered on to be engulfed by a new arm of the fog. Then, as if the swallowing of the officer had given the mist a fresh appetite, the wan light waved in a last vast billow over the clear area about the frame. Shan felt its substance cold, slimy on his skin. This was a deadly breath of unlife. He was weakened, sapped of strength, so that he hung in his bounds, his head lolling forward on his breast. Warmth pressed against him, a warm wet touch on his cold skin, a sensation of friendly concern in his mind. Shan gasped, found that he was no longer filling his lungs with that chill staleness which was the breath of the fog. He opened his eyes, struggling to raise his head. The gray light had retreated, but though a Throg blaster lay close to his feet, another only a yard beyond, there was no sign of the aliens. Instead, standing on their hind feet to press against him in a demand for his attention, were the wolverines, and seeing them, Shan dared to believe that the impossible could be true. Somehow he was safe. He spoke, and Taggy and Togi answered with eager whines. The mist was withdrawing more slowly than it had come. Here and there things lay very still on the ground. Lante! This time the call came not into his mind, but out of the air. Shan made an effort at reply which was close to a croak. Over here. A new shape in the fog was moving with purpose toward him. Torvald strode into the open, sighted Shan, and began to run. What did he began. Shan wanted to laugh, but the sound which issued from his dry throat was very little like mirth. He struggled helplessly until he managed to get out some words which made sense. Hadn't started in on me yet. You were just in time. Torvald loosened the wires which held the younger man to the frame and stood ready to catch him as he slumped forward, and the officer's hold wiped away the last clammy residue of the mist. Though he did not seem able to keep on his feet, Shan's mind was clear. What happened? He demanded. The power. Torvald was examining him hastily but with attention for every cut and bruise. The beetleheads didn't really get to work on you. Told you that, Shan said impatiently. But what brought that fog and got the throgs? Torvald smiled grimly. The ghostly light was fading as the fog retreated, but Shan could see well enough to note that around the other's neck hung one of the wyvern discs. It was a variation of the Veil of Illusion. You faced your memories under the influence of that. So did I. But it would seem that the Throgs had ones worse than either of us could produce. You can't play the role of thug all over the galaxy and not store up in the subconscious a fine line of private fears and remembered enemies. We provided the means for releasing those, and they simply raised their own devils to order. Neatest justice ever rendered. It seems that the power has a big kick, in a different way, when a Terran will manages to spark it. And you did? I made a small beginning. Also, I had the full backing of the elders and a general staff of wyverns in support. In a way, I helped to provide a channel for their concentration. Alone, they can work magic. With us, they can spread out into new fields. Tonight, we hunted Throgs as a united team, most successfully. But they wouldn't go after the one in the skull. No, direct contact with a Throg mind appears to short-circuit them. I did the contacting. They fed me what I needed. We have the answer to the Throgs now. One answer. Torvald looked back over the field where those bodies lay so still. We can kill Throgs. Maybe someday we can learn another trick. How to live with them. He returned abruptly to the present. You did contact the transport? Shan explained what had happened in the comm dome. I think when the ship broke contact that way, they understood. We'll take it that they did, and be on the move. Torvald helped Shan to his feet. If a cruiser berths here shortly, I don't propose to be under its tail flames when it sets down. The cruiser came, and a mop-up squad patrolled outward from the reclaimed camp, picked up 2 living Throgs, both wandering witlessly. But Shan only heard of that later. He slept so deep and dreamlessly that when he roused, he was momentarily dazed. A survey uniform with a cadet's badges lay across the wall seat facing his bunk in the barracks he had left how many days or weeks before? The garments fitted well enough, but he removed the insignia to which he was not entitled. When he ventured out, he saw 6 troopers of the patrol, together with Torvald, watching the cruiser lift again into the morning sky. Taggy and Togi, trailing leashes, galloped out of nowhere to hurl themselves at him in uproarious welcome, and Torvald must have heard their eager whines even through the blast of the ship, for he turned and waved Shan to join him. Where is the cruiser going? To punch a Throg base out of this system, Torvald answered. They located it on Witch. But we're staying on here? Torvald glanced at him oddly. There won't be any settlement now, but we have to establish a conditional embassy post, and the patrol has left a guard. Embassy post? Shan digested that. Yes, of course. Torvald, because of his close contact with the wyverns, would be left here for the present to act as liaison officer in charge. We don't propose, the other was continuing, to allow to lapse any contact with the one intelligent alien race we have discovered who can furnish us with full-time partnership to our mutual benefit. And there mustn't be any bungling here. Shan nodded. That made sense. As soon as possible, Warlock would witness the arrival of another team, one slanted this time to the cultivation of alien friendship and alliance rather than preparation for Terran colonists. Would they keep him on? He supposed not. The Wolverine's usefulness was no longer apparent. Don't you know your regulations? There was a snap in Torvald's demand which startled Shan. He glanced up, discovered the other surveying him critically. You're not in uniform. No, sir, he admitted. I couldn't find my own kit. Where are your badges? Shan's hand went up to the marks left when he had so carefully ripped off the insignia. My badges? I have no rank, he replied, bewildered. Every team carries at least one cadet on strength. Shan flushed. There had been one cadet on this team. Why did Torvald want to remember that? Also, the other's voice sounded remote. There can be appointments made in the field, for cause. Those appointments are left to the discretion of the officer in charge, and they are never questioned. I repeat, you are not in uniform, Lante. You will make the necessary alteration and report to me at Headquarters Dome. As sole representatives of Terra here, we have a matter of protocol to be discussed with our witches, and they have a right to expect punctuality from a pair of warlocks, so get going. Shan still stood, staring incredulously at the officer. Then Torvald's official severity vanished in a smile which was warm and real. Get going, he ordered once more, before I have to log you for inattention to orders. Shan turned, nearly stumbling over Taggy, and then ran back to the barracks in quest of some very important bits of braid he hoped he could find in a hurry. Thank you for joining us for Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton. After a short break, we will resume with our next book, Wild Nature Won by Kindness by Elizabeth Brightwin. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.